What you are about to hear in today's video is not the typical story of gods and heroes. These are buried mysteries, ancient voices that time tried to silence. Get ready for a journey into the darkest and most forgotten side of Greek mythology. The Prophecy of Themis, the son who will destroy his father. There are stories that travel through the centuries like distant echoes, legends buried beneath layers of time and forgetfulness, tales that resist complete explanation because they hold at their core a mystery that cannot be captured. And among those tales, there is one that shines with a particular unease, like a warning that never ceases. The ancient prophecy of Themis, the goddess of justice and cosmic order, who spoke of a son who would destroy his father. A simple phrase, yet filled with terrifying power, as though it concealed within it the secret code of the downfall of the gods. In Greek mythology, prophecies were not mere predictions. They were sentences. They were inevitable lines of fate that, once revealed, could no longer be avoided. When Themis, one of the most ancient titanesses, dared to utter that warning, she was not speaking out of emotion or whim. She spoke as the order of the universe itself, as the impersonal law that fulfills itself with relentless precision. And what she said echoed with the tremor of the unstoppable. The son will be born, and he will overthrow the father. The story seems to repeat itself like a pattern the Greeks knew all too well. Uranus, the sky, was overthrown by his son Cronus. Cronus, in turn, was defeated by his son Zeus. A line of power flowing from generation to generation through violence, betrayal, and divine blood. But the most disturbing part of this chain is not that it happened once, but that it seems to be woven into the very fabric of myth, as though rebellion against the father were part of a cosmic cycle, a curse no god could escape. When Themis spoke her prophecy, it was not during just any moment. It happened during the great crisis that preceded the birth of Athena. Zeus, king of the gods, had taken Metis, the goddess of cunning wisdom, as his wife. And Metis became pregnant. Until then, everything seemed to flow with the deceptive calm of days before a storm. But then Themis spoke, and her voice brought with it a chilling wind. If Metis gave birth, the son that would be born would not only be wiser than his father, but also more powerful. And when he grew up, he would overthrow him. Zeus, who had lived the war against his father Cronus firsthand, needed no proof or explanation. He remembered perfectly how Cronus, upon learning of a similar prophecy, devoured all his children one by one in an attempt to avoid his fate. And he also knew that even that brutality could not prevent him, the youngest of his sons, from surviving and overthrowing him from within the depths of time itself. Now it was his turn to stand on the other side of the cycle. And as if fear were guiding him, he decided to act before the prophecy could take shape. According to ancient accounts, Zeus deceived Metis with gentle words and convinced her to transform into a drop of water. Then, in an act that defies all logic and understanding, he swallowed her. Not as someone who destroys something, but as someone who hides it within himself, trying to trap fate inside his own body. He thought he had won, that the word of Themis would not be fulfilled this time. But it was not so. What happened next is one of the most unsettling moments in mythology. Sometime after swallowing Metis, Zeus began to suffer an unbearable pain in his head. It was no ordinary pain. It was a growing pressure, as if something were trying to come out from within. A pounding that came not from the body, but from the soul itself. And then, according to myth, he asked Hephaestus, the god of the forge, for help, and without hesitation, Hephaestus split Zeus's skull open with a divine axe. From that wound, Athena was born, already an adult, armed, radiant, with a shield in one hand and wisdom in the other. At first glance, it seemed that Zeus had triumphed. He had contained the threat, transformed the birth of the destructive son into the emergence of an allied daughter. But the prophecy did not disappear, because Themis had not only spoken of a son, she had spoken of a destiny. And destiny, in the Greek tradition, always finds a crack through which to seep. Some obscure texts, lost in the margins of classical accounts, suggest that Metis was pregnant not with one, but with two beings. Athena was the first. The second child, the true destroyer, was never born. Or at least, not visibly. Some say he remains asleep inside the body of Zeus, a latent presence that has yet to awaken. Others, bolder, claim that the second child was indeed born, but not as a god, rather as an idea. A consciousness planted within humanity that will one day awaken and bring about the fall of the old ways. Some have tried to interpret this story as a metaphor for the fear of change, the tyranny of power, and the eternal cycle of revolutions. Others read it as a cryptic warning about knowledge. Metis was not just wisdom, she was divine cunning. And Zeus, by devouring her, became the bearer of a knowledge he did not fully understand. Perhaps Athena represents only the visible part of that knowledge. Perhaps what sleeps inside the god is a form of consciousness even more ancient, more dangerous, and more lucid than the gods themselves can control. The prophecy of Themis, far from being fulfilled literally, might be fulfilling itself symbolically. Every time power tries to control truth and wisdom in order to stay on the throne. Because if there is one thing these myths teach us, it is that absolute control always has cracks, and that no father, no matter how omnipotent he believes himself to be, can escape forever from the judgment of what he has created. Even today, so many centuries after the voices of the temples have gone silent, and the statues have crumbled into ruins, the echo of that phrase still seems to slip into the darkest corners of history. The son will destroy the father, not as revenge, not as punishment, but as a necessity written, from the very beginning, into the fabric of the cosmos. Because perhaps, deep down, that was always the warning of Themis, that even the gods, like men, must face what they have created, and that no power is eternal if it defies time, destiny, and truth. The cursed skull of Orpheus. Among the stories that emerge like persistent shadows from the mists of Greek mythology, there is one that possesses a disturbing beauty and a darkness that refuses to fade. It is the story of a poet capable of stopping the fury of the elements with his voice, of enchanting wild beasts with the strings of his lyre, of making stones themselves weep with his verses. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, muse of epic poetry, and possibly of Apollo, the god of art and prophecy, was not an ordinary mortal. He was an in-between being, a bridge between the world of men and the invisible realm. But the most unsettling part of his story is not his life. What truly feeds the oldest nightmares is what happened after his death. Legend says that Orpheus was torn apart by the Maenads, women possessed by the ritual madness of Dionysus. They attacked him while he, already withdrawn from the noise of humanity, sang melancholy songs on the banks of a river in Thrace. They destroyed him with sacred violence, with a frenzy that knew no mercy. And yet the most extraordinary thing happened afterward. His head, even separated from his body, kept singing. It floated along the waters of the Hebrus River, still alive, still melodic, until it reached the island of Lesbos. There it was found, some say, by fishermen who heard the melody pierce through the morning mist. Others claim it was a blind woman who found it buried in the sand, guided by a voice that seemed to come from the center of the world. That head, turned into a skull over time, became both a relic and a curse. It was buried in an underground temple and guarded for generations by priests who swore eternal silence. No one could speak of the exact location where it rested. Some say that those who tried to desecrate it in search of power or wisdom lost their minds. Others say the voice never stopped speaking, that among the whispers of the wind, on certain damp and cold nights, one could hear forgotten verses in languages no one spoke anymore. The Orphic cult, born of his name, developed a doctrine that went beyond the worship of the Olympian gods. It was initiatory knowledge, dark, intimately tied to the soul, to death, and to the possibility of rebirth. Orpheus had not only descended into Hades in search of his beloved Eurydice, he had returned with secrets no mortal was meant to know. According to certain gold tablets found in tombs in southern Italy and Crete, Orphic initiates believed that the human soul was divine and imprisoned in the body. Death was not the end, but the threshold of a cycle of purification that could be broken if the correct song was known, the exact rite, the lost word. And it is here that the mystery of the cursed skull becomes denser, more unsettling. Because it is believed that this skull, beyond legend, was a physical object, a tangible relic. Fragmentary references in ancient texts speak of an oracular head, a sacred object to which people turned in search of answers, of visions, of inspiration. Some compared it to the Oracle of Delphi, though darker, more dangerous. Because the Oracle of Orpheus did not answer men's questions, it planted them in their dreams. It etched them into their consciousness, slowly, like a sweet poison that corrodes from within. The Greek writer Pausanias, in his descriptions of Greece, mentions the existence of an Orphic oracle in Lesbos, where Orpheus's head was said to be buried. But over time, the place was forgotten, perhaps deliberately, because the early church, which harshly fought the mystery cults, reportedly pursued the followers of Orpheus with particular obsession, more than other pagan groups. Their symbolism, their idea of inner divinity, their disdain for conventional gods, all of that made them dangerous, subversive. Even more disturbing is the possibility that Orpheus's remains, if they physically existed, were moved, hidden, or even ritually dismembered a second time. Certain esoteric traditions mention that his skull was guarded by different lineages of initiates who carried it from Lesbos to Thrace, then to Samothrace, and finally to a region in northern Greece where all trace disappears. Unlike Christian relics, which were publicly venerated, this relic was protected in the shadows, because, it is said, it possessed a power that could not be shared, a knowledge that should not be spoken. What is most fascinating is how the myth has survived discreetly in other cultures and times. In some medieval versions of Celtic legends, there appears the figure of the decapitated bard, whose head speaks for centuries, offering prophecies from deep within a sealed hill. In Balkan folklore, there are songs about skulls that sing in the darkness of the earth, guiding those who have lost their spiritual way. And in certain Hermetic circles of the Renaissance, there was talk of a skull of whispers, an allegory, or perhaps something more, of an ancient wisdom that could not be written or read, only listened to in silence. Was the skull of Orpheus one of those objects of ancestral power, part of a knowledge older even than the gods of Olympus? Or was his story a symbol of what happens when art and knowledge transcend humanity and become dangerously eternal? What is certain is that the myth endures through time not because it tells us something simple, but because it continues to pulse with questions no god has answered. Questions without shape, but which can be sensed when silence stretches longer than usual. When the wind brushes the skin with a rhythm that is no accident. When one, without knowing why, feels that something is listening from within the earth. Orpheus defied death not with a sword, but with music. And that act, strange as it may seem, was feared more than any armed rebellion. Because he who sings in the realm of the dead, who draws tears from the judges of the underworld, is not challenging the gods. He is touching the secret order that sustains them. And that order, no matter how sacred it is believed to be, always has a crack through which the voice of one who should no longer speak seeps through. Perhaps the cursed skull of Orpheus is still there, buried in some forgotten corner of the world, waiting for someone to listen to it again. Or perhaps it never existed in a physical sense, but still sings on another plane, as a symbol of that voice that neither time nor death has managed to silence. That voice that needs no body to resonate, because it already lives in us, in the hollows of our memory, in the echo of the questions we do not dare to ask. And there it will remain, singing beneath the earth, until someone dares to decipher its final song. The faceless goddess of Samothrace. There are places that vibrate with a different kind of silence, a silence that is not merely the absence of noise, but something deeper, heavier, as if what is left unsaid holds more power than anything ever spoken aloud. One such place is the island of Samothrace, a hidden gem in the northern Aegean Sea, where the wind caresses ruins that still seem to remember. There, on the mist-covered slope of a mountain, some of the most enigmatic rites of the ancient world were once held. The mysteries of Samothrace, a reserved, secret, impenetrable cult. And at the heart of that mystery, hidden among names and symbols, appears the most unsettling figure in the entire Greek esoteric tradition, the Faceless goddess. Many have heard of the Eleusinian mysteries, of Persephone's symbolic journey, of the grain that dies only to be reborn. But Samothrace was different. Samothrace did not speak of agriculture or the cycle of the seasons. Its rites were wrapped in a denser, more ancient darkness, as though what was worshipped there did not fully belong to this world. It is known that the initiates who participated in these ceremonies swore eternal silence. It is believed they did not speak of Olympian gods or heroes. What was venerated there was something more primitive, deeper, something that in many of the surviving texts did not even have a name. Among the deities that formed part of these mysteries was a female figure, vaguely mentioned as one of the Kabiri gods, although her identity was never entirely clear. In some inscriptions, she appears as Axieros, a name that offers few clues. In others, it is hinted that she may have been an ancient form of Demeter, or perhaps one of the great mother figures who preceded the Hellenic pantheon. But what is most unsettling is not the lack of information. It is how little those who wrote about her dared to say. Her presence was powerful, unavoidable, yet never defined. And when she was depicted, she had no face. In the archaeology of Samothrace, fragments abound. Fallen columns, broken capitals, altars with no more fire. But among all those remnants stands out an absence. No clear representation of this goddess has been found. There are no complete statues, no sculpted faces, only fragments, headless torsos, reliefs suggesting a feminine figure shrouded in a veil that conceals every feature. One might think this is mere chance, that time has destroyed what was once whole. But those who study these ruins closely recognize a pattern, an intentional erasure, a ritual omission. Some researchers believe that this figure was deliberately left faceless because she represented a force older than language and form. She was not a person. She was not a story. She was a presence. Something that existed before the gods had names, and that still existed deep in the earth, in the very roots of the mystery. In this sense, her face was not destroyed. It was never sculpted, because her essence was sacred anonymity, pure silence. Others, more daring, propose an even more disturbing hypothesis, that the faceless goddess was not a single figure, but an idea that took on different forms depending on the initiate. Each person who passed through the Samothracian rituals saw a different image, felt a different energy, received a vision tailored to their own inner abyss. And that is why she could not be represented. Because she did not exist as something external, but as a reflection of the soul. A deity with no fixed shape because her realm was consciousness itself. One of the most disconcerting details is that major historical figures were initiated into these mysteries. Philip of Macedon, The father of Alexander the Great sought protection in Samothrace. His wife, Olympias, became a devoted believer. Even Julius Caesar, centuries later, visited the sanctuary in search of fortune and guidance. It was not a marginal cult. It was a school of power, a gateway to a kind of knowledge that was not taught through words, but through symbols, sensations, internal transformations. And the most surprising thing is that everyone who passed through there, kings, generals, philosophers, kept the same silence. No one broke the oath. No one ever told exactly what they saw. Among the few accounts that have survived, one is particularly chilling in its ambiguity. A text attributed to an anonymous initiate, recovered in fragments centuries later, describes a moment in the rite where one had to close their eyes completely. A female figure approached, enveloped in smoke and chants. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply was. And her mere presence triggered a spiritual vertigo, a loss of meaning. The initiate was certain of having been seen from within, stripped of all masks, not by someone, but by something. A force that needed no face because it knew every corner of the human soul. Today, the sanctuary lies in ruins. But some say that on certain nights, when the wind blows from the north and the sea stirs without apparent cause, a muffled echo can be heard vibrating among the stones. It is not music, nor a voice. It is a presence, a vibration, as if something were still there, waiting, as if the faceless goddess had not disappeared, but continued to watch from a plane we can no longer see. The mystery of Samothrace has not been solved, because it is not something that can be solved with logic or with excavations. It is a mystery that resists analysis precisely because it was never meant to be explained, only experienced. And those who lived it chose to carry it with them to the grave. Perhaps deep down, that was the true face of the goddess, the pure experience of mystery, the certainty that there are things which exist beyond form, beyond name, beyond reason. A teaching that has survived without temples, without priests, without scriptures, but which still lingers, waiting in the memory of an island where silence weighs more than words, and where the face of the sacred is not carved in stone, but in the consciousness of those who dare to look into the invisible. The Enigma of Amphion, the man who built with music. Among the most baffling stories of the ancient world, there is one that resists simple explanations. A story repeated in hushed tones, almost like a forgotten superstition, yet one that has survived on the fringes of Greek mythology. It is the story of Amphion, the man who made stones rise with music, who built the walls of a city without tools, without hands, without force, guiding matter as one guides a melody. His tale, wrapped in the veil of the impossible, continues to puzzle those who study it, because it suggests the existence of a lost power, one that defied physical logic and may have been hidden within the very art of sound. Amphion was the son of Zeus and Antiope, a mortal woman pursued by scandal and tragedy. Alongside his twin brother Zethus, he was abandoned, raised by shepherds, and later recognized as the legitimate heir to Thebes. While Zethus became a symbol of brute strength and physical endurance, Amphion stood out for a talent that seemed to have no human origin. From a young age, his relationship with the lyre was almost supernatural. Legend says it was Apollo who taught him to play, although some claim it was not teaching but direct transmission, as if the instrument had recognized something ancient within him, an echo of a harmony older than the visible world. When the brothers decided to raise the walls of Thebes, Zethus carried stones, sweated and toiled, while Amphion sat to the side and played his lyre. What happened next is recorded in multiple ancient sources. The stones, as if they had a life of their own, began to move by themselves, lifting from the ground, fitting together in perfect symmetry. The city was built without hands, but not without intent. It was the music that directed the work, the melody that set the rhythm for an architectural masterpiece that, centuries later, continued to astonish with its perfection. This episode has long been considered pure fantasy. A metaphor, some say, for the contrast between strength and intelligence, between the physical and the spiritual. But that interpretation does not fully contain the unease this myth provokes, because what it suggests is not simply that music moves or inspires, but that it holds real power over matter, that there is a connection between sound and form, between vibration and structure, which at some point in human history was understood and then forgotten. Curiously, this idea is not foreign to other traditions of the ancient world. In Egypt, certain priests claimed that the world was created by the spoken word, and that everything had a true name that could be activated through precise intonations. In Vedic India, mantras were not mere prayers but formulas of resonance that modified both internal and external reality. Even in early Pythagorean treatises, music was described as divine proportion, as a sonic mathematics that ordered the cosmos. The story of Amphion then does not seem so isolated. It may be the remnant of a shared knowledge, lost in the sands of time, a forgotten wisdom that understood vibration as a tool to build, to heal, to move, or to destroy. If everything in the universe is frequency, as many modern scientists have begun to accept, why should the idea of moving matter with music seem so impossible? There are those who have tried to explore this enigma from a more technical perspective. Some scholars have investigated the possibility that certain frequencies produced by ancient instruments could have affected human perception, or even matter itself. There has been talk of harmonic resonance, of directed vibrations, of sonic architecture. In megalithic constructions across various cultures, such as in Baalbek, in Malta, or even in Greece, there are blocks so colossal they defy all practical explanation, using the tools of the time. The hypothesis of a technology based on sound has been considered, ridiculed, and, in some circles, secretly studied. Amphion's lyre, then, would not be merely an instrument of art, but a device of activation, a key to a kind of knowledge we no longer possess. In the Orphic mysteries, music held a central role in rituals of spiritual transformation. In the Eleusinian mysteries, sound accompanied symbolic transitions between life and death. Always, in every case, vibration was linked to the passage from one state to another. And what if Amphion did not only build with music, but used his lyre to alter the very fabric of reality? The tragedy of Amphion also deserves to be told, because at the heart of his power lay his downfall. After the death of his children, killed by Apollo and Artemis as punishment for his wife Niobe's arrogance, the musician abandoned his art and fell into silent despair. His story fades into shadows. Some say he took his own life, others that he was slain by the very gods who once protected him. What is certain is that his lyre fell silent, and with it, the power that moved stones vanished from the world. In the centuries that followed, many tried to replicate what he had done. Some imitated his music. Others tried to decipher his rhythm, his scale, his lost notes. But the magic did not return, as if Amphion's gift had been unique, or worse, as if the world were no longer in tune with that kind of resonance, as if something had closed forever, leaving only legend as witness. There remain, however, a few traces, fragments of ancient texts that describe walls built without hands, tales of stones that dance to the rhythm of a melody, forgotten inscriptions that mention the song that lifts columns. And in the silence of certain ruins, if one listens closely, one can still feel a subtle vibration, an echo not carried by the wind, but by something deeper, as if the stones remember, as if Amphion's song had not vanished completely, but still slept between the cracks of time, waiting for ears capable of hearing it once more. The Island of Leuce, the paradise that vanished from the map, in the gray waters of the Black Sea, among unpredictable currents and mists that seem eternal, there once existed an island that for centuries was considered sacred, a sanctuary inaccessible to the living and the eternal home of fallen heroes. They called it Leuce, which means the White One, a name that sounds more like a vision than a geographical coordinate. According to ancient sources, Leuce was not merely a remote island. It was a crossing point between worlds, a limbo where the divine and the human brushed against each other in ways no one could quite explain. How or why? The oldest Greek texts already mention its existence. Homer does not name it directly, but later authors such as Arctinus of Miletus, Pindar, Apollonius of Rhodes, and the Roman historian Arrian clearly place it at the mouth of the Istros River, which we now know as the Danube. Their descriptions match an islet near the current border between Romania and Ukraine, a mass of land said to disappear and reappear at the will of the gods. In that place, the ancient Greeks believed Achilles, the invincible hero who fell before the walls of Troy by a poisoned arrow, was taken after death to live a second existence. Leuce was not just a funerary myth. It was, according to ancient testimonies, a site that physically existed and which some sailors claimed to have reached. In those accounts, the place was neither vast nor lush, but it was bathed in a different kind of light. Legends describe it as covered with silvery trees, fields that gleamed under the moon, and a temple dedicated to Achilles where sailors made offerings and consulted oracles. The island was small, but footsteps did not echo the same way on its ground. Some believed that whoever slept there for one night would never return the same. What is fascinating is that Leuce, unlike other mythical lands such as Atlantis or the Hesperides, has multiple cross-references among authors from different eras and regions. Strabo speaks of it. Ptolemy mentions it in his geography. Even Pliny the Elder describes it as a real place, inhabited by sacred birds that cleaned Achilles' temple with their own wings. It was not then a vague symbol, but a specific site that, for some reason, began to fade from maps over time, until it vanished entirely. By the time of the Byzantine Empire, people already spoke of the island no one could find, although some expeditions claimed to have seen it from afar, through the mist, like a white glimmer on the horizon. During the Middle Ages, Leuce turned into a dangerous legend. It was said that those who approached too closely saw things they could not explain. Some sailors claimed to hear songs coming from no visible body. Others spoke of ruined columns where torches lit themselves without fire. Over time, even the name faded into obscurity, and what had once been a site of pilgrimage became a footnote in dusty treatises. Modern archaeologists identify an island called Zmeïni, or Snake Island, as the possible historical Leuce. It is located precisely in the region indicated by the ancient texts, but those who have visited it say there are no temples, no clear ruins, no visible signs of Greek occupation. Only a military base, eroded stones, and a few solitary birds watching the sea from above. However, there are details that suggest not everything is as it seems. Some column remnants have been found underwater, along the island's coast. Marble fragments, engraved with Greek letters nearly erased by salt. An altar discovered buried near the center of the island, with partially legible inscriptions referring to the Lord of Winds and the Dead. The possibility that Leuce once existed as a lost sanctuary, whose remains were swallowed by the sea or destroyed by centuries of occupation and neglect, is becoming more plausible. But at the same time, the story remains confined to a dimension that does not quite fit archaeological reality. Because Leuce was not just a physical place. It was a promise, a refuge of the gods for the few mortals who, like Achilles, had earned the right to escape final death. In the Orphic versions of Greek myths, which often hide a more esoteric view of tradition, Leuce appears as a transitional station of the soul, a place where the warrior does not rest, but transforms, where the heroic is purified to become divine. It is not a paradise of pleasures, but a kind of clear, clean threshold where all unnecessary things vanish. A space for contemplation before the return, if there is a return. In fact, in some hidden traditions, it is said that Leuce is not located only at a point on the map, but also on a different level of existence. That one does not reach it by ship, but by transformation. And if that theory is true, then its disappearance is not a mystery, but a consequence. If the gods have withdrawn, if the heroes have fallen silent, then Leuce no longer has a reason to appear. Failing to see it would be the natural result of having forgotten the sacred language with which the paths were invoked. As if paradise had not been destroyed, but closed itself off because no one remembers how to reach it. In a way, Leuce represents a kind of lost knowledge, a collective memory that has dissolved over time. Its disappearance is not only geographical, it is spiritual. When the world stopped believing that heroes could ascend, when rituals were replaced by doctrines and songs by decrees, the threshold of Leuce closed, and with it, the possibility of looking to the horizon and seeing something beyond the line between sky and sea. Sometimes, when one looks at a modern map of the Black Sea, it is hard to imagine that a sanctuary dedicated to an immortal hero once existed there. It is even harder to believe that ancient sailors sought it with hope, lit lamps for it, and spoke with reverence of the white island where the wind blew with different intent. But perhaps the important thing is not to prove it existed, but to understand why its story has not died. Because as long as someone remembers its name, as long as there is someone who wonders what happened to it, Leuce will continue to exist somewhere, not on the map, but on the invisible edge between myth and truth. The silence of the Pythias, the seeresses who fell forever silent. At the top of Mount Parnassus, where the wind beats against the stones with a rhythm that seems dictated by an invisible will, stood one of the most sacred places of ancient Greece, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. There, for centuries, spoke the voice of a woman seated on a tripod, shrouded in vapors rising from the earth, staring into the void with the eyes of time. She was the Pythia, the prophetess of Apollo, the intermediary between gods and men. Her word was law, and her voice, though human, bore the weight of fate. What many forget is that there came a day when she ceased to speak. Not because a woman died, but because something deeper was broken. And since then, the silence of the Pythias weighs heavier than all their words. For nearly 1,000 years, the Pythias were heard by kings, generals, philosophers, and travelers who came from the farthest corners of the Mediterranean world. Each approached with fear and reverence, hoping to hear a fragment of truth amid the confusion of humanity. The priestess, entering a trance, spoke words that were often obscure, enigmatic, but charged with a force that could not be faked. It was not theater. It was not naive superstition. There was something there, something ancient, something not entirely belonging to the visible world. The preparation of the Pythia was rigorous. She had to purify herself with water from the Castalian spring, withdraw in silence, invoke Apollo, and enter into communion with the emanations of a deep fissure beneath the temple floor. That fissure, according to many ancient accounts, released sacred vapors, what some today interpret as ethylene or methane gases, that induced an altered state of consciousness. But to reduce the experience to a mere chemical reaction would be to deny the spiritual and cultural context of that trance. Because what was lived in Delphi was a rite of transformation, an experience so intense that many Pythias did not survive it for more than a few years of service. The Pythia's words were recorded by priests, interpreted, reformulated if necessary, and passed on to the petitioners. Decisions of war, treaties of peace, the founding of entire colonies depended on those phrases. And yet, despite their power and centrality, almost nothing of them has survived intact. Only a few fragments remain, often distorted or translated with bias. as if that entire stream of wisdom had evaporated with the same vapor that rose from the womb of the earth. For centuries, the Oracle of Delphi was a constant. In times of chaos, it was the only fixed point. In times of prosperity, it was the guardian of balance. But toward the end of the Hellenistic period, something began to change. The temple lost influence, the number of petitioners dwindled, the rituals became less frequent. The Pythias, once chosen from among older women with experience and wisdom, began to be replaced by symbolic figures, without the same preparation, as if the process had been emptied from within. Some historians attribute this decline to the rise of Rome, the erosion of the cult, or changes in beliefs. But those who know the deeper history of the temple sense that what happened was far more disturbing. The fissure stopped speaking. It was not a collapse. It was not a ruin, nor an invasion. It was a sacred blackout. One day, simply, the vapors ceased. The ceremonies continued for a while, more out of habit than conviction. But the trance no longer came. The inspiration dried up. The voice of Apollo, which for centuries had echoed from the depths of the earth, faded like a song lost in the wind. The Pythia sat on the tripod, reciting hollow words, while the priests tried to maintain the illusion. But everyone knew that something had broken. No one has ever fully explained what caused that silence. Some modern geologists claim that an earthquake or a shift in tectonic activity may have sealed the fissure. Others suggest that political and religious changes of the time caused the ritual to lose power, that the magic faded due to lack of faith. But that view, logical as it may seem, does not reach the true dimension of the mystery. Because in Delphi, the loss of the voice was not just a natural phenomenon, nor an institutional crisis. It was a symbolic ending, a tear in the invisible fabric that united the human with the divine. The last Pythia on record was a woman named Phimono, although it is likely that this was not her real name, but a convention used by Christian chroniclers to refer to the temple's decline. What is known is that during the final period, the prophecies became increasingly vague, more incoherent. Some ancient texts mention phrases that seemed devoid of meaning, as if the Pythia were speaking to an empty echo, as if, in trying to communicate with the gods, she received only the reflection of her own despair. With the arrival of Christianity, the temple was officially closed, its records destroyed, its priests scattered. The columns fell, the altars were turned to ruins, and the Castalian spring dried up for decades. But the mystery did not die. It remained suspended, like a sigh never released. Because even after its silence, the memory of the Oracle of Delphi continued to pulse in the collective consciousness like an open wound, like the longing for a bridge that no longer exists. In recent decades, excavations at the site have revealed details that confirm some of the oldest legends. The existence of a natural fissure has been confirmed, vapors have been detected, and ritual objects have been found buried beneath layers of stone and ash. But the heart of the mystery remains untouched. No one has succeeded in replicating the trance state the ancient Pythias experienced. No one has managed to explain why their voice was so precise, so respected, and why it vanished from one day to the next without a trace. The most disturbing part is that this silence remains relevant today. Because in a world saturated with noise, with speeches, with shallow information, the figure of the Pythia becomes ever more unsettling. A lone woman, seated at the heart of the earth, speaking with the gods. And then, nothing. The interruption. The abyss. Perhaps the Oracle of Delphi was not merely a temple. Perhaps it was a door. And in closing, that door sealed more than just a religious tradition. It sealed a possibility. The possibility of hearing a different voice, not human, but close. A voice that spoke from within the earth as if the earth itself had something to tell us. and now that it is silent, everything else sounds hollow. The child of Pan, a creature that awoke madness. The ancient Greeks, with all their philosophical sophistication and reverence for the order of the Olympian gods, also felt a reverent fear toward that which could not be controlled or explained. Deep within the forests, among the creaking branches and the whispers of a wind that seemed to blow from no particular direction, dwelled a presence far removed from the majesty of Apollo and the judgment of Zeus. It was something more primitive, more visceral, more ancient. A figure that seemed to mock the celestial laws and laugh at rational thought. His name was Pan. But the most disturbing part was not the god himself, but the story of his birth, his appearance, and his laughter. Because what came into the world was not an ordinary child, not even a conventional god, but a creature that, from its very first breath, provoked panic. The myth tells that Pan was born of a nymph. Some versions say she was the daughter of Dryops, others that she was Penelope, though not the same one who waited for Odysseus. His father, most often identified as Hermes, carried him in his arms to Olympus after the birth, caught between confusion and nervous laughter, because what he held was not a baby with smooth skin and innocent eyes, but a hybrid creature with goat hooves, a body covered in hair, horns, and a wide, mocking smile. Upon seeing him, the gods laughed. They called him Pan because, they said, his appearance brought joy to everyone. But that light reading hides something more unsettling. What they felt was not exactly joy, but a very specific kind of disarray. A sudden disturbance, like a forced laugh born of bewilderment, as if the child had come not to bring order, but to break it. From the very beginning, Pan was linked to the untamable. It was said he lived among the trees, in the mountains, in deep caves, where echoes distort and time seems to slow. His music, played on a reed flute, could cause ecstasy or terror. It did not depend on the melody, but on who was listening and how it resonated within their soul. And that is what made Pan so disconcerting. He was a god who gave no answers, who offered no justice, who did not explain his purpose. He simply existed as a wild, intense, and deeply unpredictable force. The ancient Greeks feared him with a special kind of respect. It was not fear of punishment, as with Ares or Hades, but something more irrational, more immediate. In fact, the word panic derives directly from him. It was that instinctive reaction, that sudden jolt in the forest, when the heart races for no reason and breathing becomes difficult, as if an invisible being were watching from behind the trunks. Pan was not the monster that attacks. He was the feeling that something might happen at any moment. He was the anticipation of chaos. What makes the figure of Pan even more disturbing is that he appears on the margins. He is not the protagonist of great epics. He does not take part in the Titanic wars. He holds no throne on Olympus. But he is always present, like a shadow peeking in where the gods do not reach. He is a god of the in-between, of the moment between wakefulness and sleep, of the space between civilization and nature. And in those limits, his figure grows, blurs, becomes a symbol of that which refuses to be tamed. For centuries, peasants and shepherds claimed to have heard him. Stories passed down through generations spoke of fleeting encounters with a creature that appeared at dusk, played its flute, and then vanished into the underbrush, leaving behind a soft, faintly sarcastic laugh, as if amused by its own effect on humans. In some cases, those encounters were accompanied by altered experiences, hallucinations, visions in which reality folded in on itself. And when they returned, the witnesses were no longer the same. Some modern scholars have sought to see in Pan an archetypal symbol of the unconscious, a figure representing the darker and more chaotic side of the human soul. Carl Jung saw him as a manifestation of the wild self, an energy that emerges when the social mask breaks. But even beyond psychological analysis, What cannot be denied is that Pan holds the power of the real, not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense, that which, even if unseen, transforms. The child of Pan, then, is not a funny tale of eccentric gods. It is the origin of an unease that has survived for centuries. The creature that, from the moment of its birth, sparked nervous laughter and extreme reactions, symbolizes something that goes beyond folklore. It represents the entrance of the wild into a world that constantly tries to organize itself. It is the laugh that breaks the protocol, the sound that shatters a silence that is too rigid, the madness that peeks through when one has been alone for too long in nature, far from the structures that protect us. Some authors from the Hellenistic period wrote about a curious phenomenon related to his cult. Episodes of collective madness that erupted in rural areas after festivals in honor of Pan. There was talk of groups of people who, after dancing for hours to the sound of the flute, fell into trances, screamed in unknown tongues, hurled themselves into the forest, and disappeared for days. When they returned, they came back with a lost gaze, saying they had seen a creature with a goat's body and human eyes, one that had made them laugh, cry, and scream all at once. Over time, Pan was demonized. During the rise of Christianity, his figure was absorbed and distorted. His horns and legs were associated with the devil. His flute became the song of deception. What was once the representation of the power of wild nature became a symbol of evil. But even in that transformation, something of his essence remained. Because the image of the being that awakens chaos, that shakes the soul with a sudden laugh, remains alive in many traditions. In recent centuries, a few isolated testimonies have kept the flame of the myth alive. Mountaineers in the Balkans claim to have felt his presence, musicians who have heard melodies they could not reproduce, dreamers who, without knowing why, wake with the sound of a flute in their minds. Perhaps Pan no longer walks among the trees, or perhaps he never left. Perhaps his madness was not an illness, but a different way of understanding the world. A sudden awakening, yes, but a necessary one, because sometimes the only way to escape the excess of reason is through the sudden tremor of a song that reminds us we are still alive. The Dream of Endymion, the man who never awoke. In the most serene yet unsettling corners of Greek mythology, there are stories that do not scream, that do not burn like the wars of heroes or the punishments of wrathful gods, but rather slip quietly between wakefulness and dreaming, like a persistent whisper that continues to resonate in memory. One of those stories is that of Endymion, the man who slept forever, not as a punishment, nor as death, but as an act of desire, surrender, and mystery. His figure appears and disappears in ancient sources like a mirage. Sometimes he is a shepherd, other times a king, and even an astronomer. But in every version there is one unchanging element. He sleeps. And his sleep is not rest, but a luminous prison, chosen or imposed, in which time came to a disconcerting halt. Endymion was young, beautiful, and contemplative. He lived, according to most accounts, in the region of Caria, in Asia Minor, where the mountains touch the sky with a particular melancholy, and the nights seem longer. It was said that he spent endless hours observing the heavens, motionless, silent, as if he could read something among the stars that others could not see. And it was on one of those eternal nights that Selene, the goddess of the moon, saw him. Selene is not a goddess who acts on impulse. She represents the silent rhythm of the night sky, the cadence of cycles, the light that does not blind but cannot be ignored either. When she saw Endymion, something in her broke. It was not love that she felt, at least not in the conventional sense. It was total fascination, an attraction so intense it defied even the order of the gods. She did not descend to possess him as Zeus or Dionysus might, nor to reward him as Apollo would. What she did was stranger, more unsettling. She asked that he sleep forever. Legend says it was she herself who begged Zeus to grant Endymion the gift, or the curse, of eternal sleep. And Zeus, perhaps surprised by such a peculiar request, agreed without many questions. Since then, Endymion sleeps. At the summit of Mount Latmus, his body lies in a sacred cave, untouched, motionless, suspended between life and death. Each night, Selene descends to gaze at him, to caress his sleeping face, to love him in a silence that does not interrupt the eternal slumber. And he, some say, sometimes smiles faintly, as if in his dreams he knows he is being loved from the stars. What is most disturbing about this story is not its tragic beauty, but what it suggests between the lines. Why would an immortal goddess desire that the object of her love never awaken? What kind of bond can exist only while one of the two remains unconscious? In a world where Greek myths often revolve around conflict, conquest, and revenge, the story of Endymion stands out for its unsettling stillness. It is the tale of a perfect body, motionless, desired, transformed into an altar of divine longing. And as such, it is also a story that unsettles. The ancients never reached an agreement on whether Endymion's sleep was voluntary or imposed. Some said he chose it himself, as a way to escape the pain of time, to preserve his unblemished youth, to embrace a soft eternity without disruptions. Others claimed that Selene forced him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of losing him, fear that age would take him, fear that love would become memory. And in that act, she turned him into a living idol, a sculpture of flesh that never deteriorates. In certain Orphic traditions, Endymion represents the soul in a state of absolute contemplation. His sleep would then be a symbol of spiritual transition, a phase between incarnations, a deep rest where the soul receives the influence of the celestial spheres. From this more mystical view, Selene would not be a jealous goddess, but an initiatory figure guiding the sleeping soul toward enlightenment through beauty, stillness, and surrender. But even in that reading, something is disturbing, because that journey, that transformation, never ends. The soul never awakens. The sleep is eternal, and that makes it, ultimately, a sacred prison. Over the centuries, the myth of Endymion has been interpreted by poets, mystics, and philosophers as a metaphor for impossible love, for desire unfulfilled, or for the absolute sacrifice of the self before the sublime. But there is another angle, less romantic, darker, that has been less explored. The possibility that Endymion is not asleep, but trapped. That his body, blessed by the gods, became a vessel for something greater, more dangerous. That the sleep is not a gift, but a seal. In some fragmentary manuscripts found in the region of Asia Minor, there are references to minor cults that worshipped a sleeping man in the mountain, to whom they offered fruit, milk, and songs without words. They did not wake him. They did not ask him for favors. They simply cared for him, as if they knew that his rest was necessary to maintain an invisible balance. That if he ever awoke, something would break, something that must not break. The exact place where Endymion rests has been searched for centuries. Some point to Mount Latmus, as the most widespread tradition claims. Others argue that his cave was moved, deliberately hidden by ancient cults who feared his sleep would be disturbed. Today, those regions are marked by ruins that archaeologists have not yet fully deciphered. Temples without dedications, altars without inscriptions, underground passages that end in empty chambers, places where echoes behave strangely, and where visitors feel a heaviness in their eyelids without knowing why. Endymion remains asleep. He has not aged. He has not died, nor has he awakened. In a world that glorifies movement, progress, and action, his figure is profoundly subversive. It reminds us that there is another form of existence, that there is depth in stillness, power in silence, and perhaps a hidden truth in the longest sleep ever recorded. In the end, the myth offers no resolution. There is no clear moral, no divine judgment, no fulfilled destiny. Only a body that rests eternally under the moonlight. A goddess who visits him each night, faithful to a love that does not evolve but also never fades. And a mystery that, centuries later, still pulses strongly in the depths of the human soul. Because all of us, in some secret corner of our thoughts, have felt the desire to stop time, to sleep without guilt, to be loved even in unconsciousness, and to never wake up. The Lady of the Styx Lake. When speaking of the underworld in Greek mythology, the image that usually comes to mind is that of Charon, the grim-faced ferryman who transports souls across the black waters of the river Styx, crossing the final boundary between the world of the living and the silent realm of the dead. One thinks of Hades, Persephone, the eternal judges, the fields of punishment, and the meadows of rest. However, among the intersecting currents and the vapors rising from the depths, there exists a barely mentioned figure, a shadow that appears fleetingly in some ancient texts, always at the margins, always shrouded in mist. The Lady of the Styx Lake. Unlike other deities or entities of the underworld, this figure has no fixed place in the pantheon, possesses no official temple, nor a structured cult. Her presence is fragmentary but constant. Every time the Styx is spoken of in its darkest and most secret aspects, her name, or rather her silhouette, emerges from the silence. Some authors have described her as a fallen nymph, others as an ancient pre-Olympian goddess condemned to live in the waters of hatred, a name which in Greek means Styx. But in all the accounts, the same sensation repeats, that of a being who watches from the most hidden shores of the underworld, without intervening, without speaking, yet making her presence felt with an intensity difficult to explain. It was said that the Styx Lake was not a common body of water, not even within the parameters of mythology. It was a river that flowed in a circle, born from itself and feeding on its own eternity. A dark, viscous liquid with properties capable of breaking divine oaths and causing instant death if anyone dared to drink from it. Even the gods feared its waters. When Zeus wanted the gods to swear with full seriousness, he demanded they do so upon the Styx. Any breaking of that oath brought immediate divine punishment. 9 years of exile from Olympus, without voice or power. But what is not usually mentioned is that in the most stagnant parts of that sacred river, where the water does not flow but swirls in slow circles, there existed a lake. A natural expansion of the current, surrounded by perpetual mist, where even Charon avoided stopping his boat. There, according to certain Orphic hymns, resided the female figure whom the ancients called by many names, although seldom by a proper name. The one who watches from the shore, the guardian of the broken word, the widow of the oath. This is how those who dared write about her mentioned her. A lady without a face, veiled in shadow, who emerged in moments of greatest spiritual despair, when the soul crossed not toward death, but toward oblivion. Some esoteric testimonies, especially those linked to Orphic and Eleusinian mystery schools, connect her with the figure of Styx herself, the very personification of the river, daughter of Oceanus and Night. But the darkest texts hint that she is not exactly her. The Lady of the Styx Lake would be something else. An echo or conscious manifestation of the waters, as if the river had acquired its own intelligence and chosen to take female form to observe better. She does not judge, condemn, or reward. She simply exists. And in her existence, she exerts a pressure that goes beyond the divine, that of the gaze that does not forget. The ancients believed that everything submerged in the Styx lost its essence. Weapons, sacred objects, even names. There was a belief that if anyone pronounced their true name within the lake, it was erased forever, as if it had never existed. Therefore, those condemned to wander near its waters did so in complete silence, avoiding uttering a single word. In that scenario, the Lady of the Lake took on a sinister role. Guardian of denied memory, watcher of the forgotten. She did not protect the passage like Charon. She did not offer judgment like Rhadamanthus. She was the guardian of the irretrievable. There are scattered stories speaking of direct encounters with this figure. In an Egyptian papyrus that mixes Hellenistic elements with funerary visions, a lost soul narrates how it was guided to the edge of the Styx lake, and there found a woman who offered a cup. Instead of drinking, the soul looked at her and began to remember not only its life, but also the lives it had forgotten. The manuscript breaks off at that point but leaves an indelible impression. The Lady of the Lake was not simply a decorative figure of the underworld, but a test. A presence that could return or take memory with a simple gesture. During the Roman period, some writers of a more philosophical mindset reinterpreted the figure as an allegory of consciousness in its purest state. According to them, the Lady of the Lake represented the final moment of reflection before being completely absorbed by Hades. A last opportunity to face personal truth, without masks, without illusions. In that line of thought, she would not speak, nor act, but her mere appearance forced souls to confront their own shadow. The most puzzling thing is that, despite the vagueness with which she is mentioned, the image of the lady has survived in different cultural contexts. In some medieval Greek Orthodox origin tales, a similar figure appears, a woman dressed in black, always on the shore of a ghostly river, who offers silence in exchange for repentance. In popular stories from the southern Balkans, there is talk of a female spirit of the swamp, who only shows herself to those about to die without having fulfilled their promises. In all cases, the figure remains constant, a motionless, solitary woman with absolute power over what is remembered and what is forgotten. The Styx lake, as it was understood in antiquity, may have faded from mythological maps, but remains alive in the collective unconscious. It represents that inner place where the soul confronts the irreparable, the unspoken words, the acts that can no longer be undone. And the Lady of the Lake is the ultimate symbol of that encounter. She does not appear to everyone, only to those who have crossed certain limits, willingly or not. Her gaze does not accuse, but neither does it console. It is like water that reflects without distortion. And in that reflection, one can no longer escape oneself. It is likely that the Lady of the Styx Lake remains there, somewhere on the other side, waiting for those who have forgotten who they were, or for those who must remember something before crossing. Perhaps the most terrifying thing is not that she exists, but that one day, when all has been said, we see her face to face, and realize she has always been watching. The Curse of Niobe, the statues that cry blood. Among the echoes of Greek tragedy, resonating from the depths of time with voices of wounded pride, endless pain and punishments beyond all human logic, there is a story that rises like a petrified lament, like a scream that never fades, because it was carved in stone. It is the story of Niobe, the queen of Thebes, mother of many children, and an eternal symbol of arrogance that provoked the wrath of the gods. But beyond the well-known tale, beyond the myth repeated in theaters and treatises, there lies a darker, more persistent, and deeply unsettling dimension, that of the statues that cry blood. Because according to some versions, ignored or concealed by more sober compilers, Niobe's transformation was not the end of her punishment, but only the beginning of a motionless, inexplicable, and living suffering. Niobe was the daughter of Tantalus, the one condemned by the gods to die of thirst in front of a fountain that moved away each time he tried to drink. She inherited not only nobility from her lineage, but also an excess of pride. Married to Amphion, king of Thebes, she was mother to a debated number of children. Some say 14, others 16, and the most moderate mention 7 sons and 7 daughters. And her happiness was so overflowing that it became arrogance. One day, seeing the citizens of her kingdom gathered to offer tribute to the goddess Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, Niobe burst into scorn. She mocked the goddess and said, with a proud smile, that she, with her numerous and beautiful children, was more worthy of worship than that lonely woman who had only given birth to 2. The words quickly reached Olympus. Leto, offended, did not react with immediate fury, but with something more dangerous: cold resolve. Apollo and Artemis, obeying their mother, descended to the mortal world and executed a meticulous vengeance. One by one, Niobe's children fell under divine arrows. Some accounts say they died while dancing, others while singing hymns to their mother. Even those who tried to take refuge were mercilessly struck down. Only in certain versions did 1 or 2 daughters survive, not out of mercy, but to prolong the memory of the punishment. Niobe, before the corpses of her children, went mad with grief. She cried for days, tore her hair out, cursed the gods, herself, the entire world. But she did not die, because death would have been relief. She was turned to stone, into a rock still pointed out on the slopes of Mount Sipylus, as a hardened face that weeps without rest. And here begins the mystery. Many ancient travelers claim to have seen that stone. Pausanias, the Greek geographer, recounts with wonder how Niobe's face remained visible on the rock, and how, on humid days, drops ran from her sculpted eyes as if the tears had never stopped falling. It was not rainwater, insisted the locals. It was something else, something denser, darker, something that could not be explained by simple natural phenomena. Over the centuries, testimonies multiplied. Philosophers, priests, Roman soldiers, even passing merchants spoke of a disturbing phenomenon: statues that cried. Some were marble copies of Niobe, others supposedly original remains from the Theban cult. But what united them was inexplicable behavior. On certain days of the year, sometimes without an apparent pattern, the eyes of these figures began to moisten. At first, it seemed like condensation. Then the liquid took on a reddish hue, and occasionally, a metallic smell. As if the marble remembered, and in its memory, it bled. The phenomenon, which today would be attributed to capillarity, environmental humidity, or the chemical composition of the stones, was then interpreted as a sign, not a warning, but of eternal suffering. Because Niobe's punishment was not only petrification, it was the impossibility of forgetting, the eternity of pain. And that pain somehow filtered into the matter. It passed through the rock, contaminated the replicas, and became a physical presence. To cry stone is a symbol. To cry blood, a living curse. The Orphic mysteries, which studied the hidden dimensions of the soul, mentioned in their most private circles that certain types of punishments did not end with death, not even with transformation. There were sufferings that became cyclical, fed on collective memory, and found a way to manifest through the material. Within this framework, Niobe's statues were not mere representations but channels, conduits that allowed the soul to exhale the unbearable weight of endless pain. During the Renaissance, artists working with classical sculptures began to report strange episodes around representations of Niobe. A 16th century Florentine sculptor wrote in his diary that one of the statues commissioned for a public fountain began to sweat from the eyes just before it was finished. It was a copy inspired by the sculptural group of Niobe's family, which had been discovered in Rome. The phenomenon did not repeat, but the event was recorded, and the sculptor refused to work with that image again. Even in modern times, some statues associated with Niobe's figure have been the focus of curious investigations. In Turkey, near Mount Sipylus, the carved face on the stone is still preserved. And although most consider it a geological formation without human intervention, Some studies have detected an unusual pattern in the water seepage. It only occurs at certain times and always emerges from the same points, as if the mountain had memory. Niobe's figure, then, becomes much more than a warning against arrogance. It is a persistent presence, an embodiment of infinite mourning. Her story does not end because the stone does not fade. And as long as there are eyes that observe her face and recognize the suffering in its lines, the curse will remain active. Not as a punishment imposed by capricious gods, but as an echo of what happens when love turns into absolute loss. When looking at a statue of Niobe, anyone, in any museum, temple, or garden, one must pause for a moment and carefully observe the eyes. Sometimes, if the silence is deep enough and the light enters at just the right angle, a faint trace of moisture can be perceived at the edge of the eyelid. That is when one remembers that marble, no matter how cold it seems, can be a vessel of memory that does not erase, and that there are pains so ancient, so pure, so unfinished, that neither the passing of centuries nor the hardening of stone can contain them completely. The forbidden myth of Meleager and the flame of his life. Within the vast and complex web of stories that make up Greek mythology, there are tales that shine for their heroism, others that shock with the cruelty of the gods, and a few that unsettle because they are deeply human. Among the latter is the story of Meleager, one of the strangest and most disturbing, not so much because of the monsters he faced or the battles he fought, but because of the way his fate was tied, from birth to the fire of a simple torch. A flame that did not light a room or guide a traveler, but burned silently with the exact length of his life, as if his soul were not inside his body, but in the burning heart of a log. Meleager was born in Calydon, son of Althea and King Oeneus, at a time when prophecies were not metaphors or suggestions, but decrees that decided everything even before the first cry. According to the myth, just at the moment the child was brought into the world, the fates, those relentless figures who weave, measure, and cut the thread of every life, appeared in the room. They did not bring gifts, like the fairies of later tales, but a brutal warning. The boy would live as long as the flame of a log burning in the hearth lasted. When that flame went out, Meleager would die, regardless of his strength, his age, or the greatness of his deeds. Althea, the mother, terrified by the certainty of fate, ran to the fire, tore the still smoking log from it, and hid it in a sacred chest, where she vowed to protect it at any cost. With that gesture, she believed she had outwitted destiny, imprisoning death with bare hands. For years, the chest remained closed, and the boy grew strong, brave, and handsome, as if each day of his life were a small victory against the inevitable. Meleager became one of the most celebrated heroes of his generation. He took part in the famous Caledonian boar hunt, a monster sent by Artemis to punish men for forgetting her sacrifices. The beast devastated fields and devoured flocks with unstoppable fury, and many of Greece's bravest warriors were summoned to face it. Among them was Atalanta, the indomitable huntress who, with her agility and aim, managed to wound the boar before Meleager dealt the final blow. The hero, dazzled by Atalanta's strength and beauty, offered her the hunting trophy, provoking immediate fury in his uncles, who did not accept that a woman should receive such honor. The conflict escalated quickly. Meleager killed his own relatives in defense of Atalanta, and with that act, he sealed his fate irreversibly. What happened afterward has been passed down with a mixture of horror and fascination. Althea, upon learning that her son had killed her brothers, was consumed by grief, not by justice, nor morality, but by a visceral fury that broke the sacred bond between mother and son. In an impulse that has been interpreted in many ways, as madness, as punishment, as unconscious revenge, she opened the chest and threw the log into the fire. No one stopped her. No one knew what she saw at that moment. The only certainty is that, somewhere, Meleager felt an inexplicable heat run through his body, and before he could react, his life went out. The most disturbing aspect of this myth is not its tragic nature, but the idea that an entire existence could be linked to an external object, a piece of wood whose burning did not depend on breath, heartbeat, or will to live. Meleager did not die in battle, nor by betrayal, nor old age. He died because a flame burned, and that flame was not a symbol of his life. It was his life. This tale has been considered by many scholars as a metaphor about fate, the fragility of the human condition, and the illusion of control. But there is a more esoteric reading, much older and less widespread, which suggests that the myth of Meleager is the vestige of forgotten knowledge, that of souls tied to objects. In various archaic cultures, there is the belief that certain beings do not fully inhabit their bodies, but that their essence, their true life, is contained in a vessel, a jewel, a talisman, or, as in this case, a flame. This kind of bond is not a symbol, but a pact, and the object in question is not just any container, but a real extension of the being. Destroying it is not destroying a fetish. It is cutting the thread that holds the spirit to its physical presence. Some Egyptian and Babylonian stories speak of kings who hid their souls in statues buried beneath palaces. In Norse mythology, there are creatures whose life is contained in eggs hidden inside animals. All this suggests that the myth of Meleager could have deeper roots, connected to a magical and dangerous worldview, where the soul is separable, transferable, and vulnerable. Some fragmentary texts from mystery schools in Asia Minor, linked to the cults of Hecate and Artemis, mention a ritual where the initiate had to meditate in front of a lit candle, visualizing their entire life contained in that flame. If the candle burned out before the exercise ended, the initiate had to leave the temple and remain silent for 7 years. These texts never mention Meleager, but the parallel is unsettling. Fire as a mirror of the soul, the risk of combustion as a symbol of existential fragility. The figure of Althea, in turn, has been debated from many angles. Was she a victim of a fit of rage? An agent of fate? An instrument of a greater force? Some esoteric currents see her as a representation of the fates in human form, the earthly manifestation of inevitable death. Others believe her gesture is the ultimate symbol of pain transformed into creation. She did not kill her son. She fulfilled the design the fates had announced, and in that fulfillment, she returned the world a little darker. For centuries, the myth of Meleager was one of the most avoided by rhetoric schools. It was not easy to turn it into an example of virtue. Nor did it serve as a simple moral lesson. It was too raw, too disturbing, too full of that uncertainty that leaves open questions and heavy silences. And yet, it has survived. Because in it, as in few other stories, that unsettling feeling is revealed that some lives depend on something beyond decisions or will. Lives that burn, yes, but not from within, but from afar. The cursed echo of Narcissus. Few stories from the ancient world have endured as powerfully as that of Narcissus, the young man of unimaginable beauty who died after falling in love with his own reflection. But beneath the surface of that tale, which has been reinterpreted countless times as a symbol of excessive ego and the punishment of vanity, hides another figure relegated to the background, a whisper that repeats endlessly on the margins of the main tragedy. I refer to Echo, the nymph who could not speak, who could not love, who could do nothing but repeat the words of others, and who, according to some ancient texts, did not vanish completely, but transformed into something far more unsettling. A presence that inhabits certain places, trapped in a form of existence that defies any logical explanation. Echo was an Oread, a mountain nymph associated with valleys, caves, and forests, where solitude is so profound that time seems to stand still. Her voice, according to early Orphic poems, was melodious and clear, capable of calming wild beasts and diverting the flow of streams. But that voice was also her downfall. Hera, the goddess of marriage, jealous of the constant infidelities of her husband Zeus, found in Echo an involuntary accomplice. The nymph, charming and skilled with words, entertained Hera with long conversations, while Zeus slipped away with other nymphs. When the goddess discovered the deception, she did not punish her husband, as was customary, but unleashed her fury on the closest woman instead. She stole Echo's speech, not entirely, but in a crueler way, condemning her to only repeat the last words she heard, without the ability to begin a phrase, to express her own thoughts, desires, or pain. Turned into a literal and symbolic echo, the nymph wandered the most forgotten corners of the forest, reduced to a shadow of her former self. From that moment on, her existence was neither life nor death, but an intermediate state in which consciousness persisted without being able to manifest. And then she saw Narcissus. She watched him as he admired himself in the water's reflection, fascinated by himself, oblivious to the world around him, and felt something she had not allowed herself since her punishment. A deep impulse, a genuine desire to approach, to touch, to share the silence. But when she tried to speak to him, she only repeated what he said. Every word of Narcissus, echoed back, seemed a cruel mockery of fate. Communication was impossible, connection unreal. And yet, she did not leave. She stayed there, at the limits of perception, waiting for a way to be heard. The most well-known version says that Echo wasted away until she became a voice, that her body vanished completely, and that her soul was tied to empty spaces, to mountains where sound bounces, to caves where one can hear themselves amplified and distorted. But other, less cited texts speak of a much stranger transformation. It is said that Echo, unable to love with words, began to speak with her surroundings, that she learned to use her repetition as an instrument, and that in certain sacred places, her repetitions were not mere reflections of sound, but encrypted responses, coded messages for those who knew how to listen carefully. In the Orphic mysteries, there was the idea that certain caves were not simple geographic accidents, but portals to parallel dimensions, and that entities lived in them that could not speak with their own voice. In those spaces, the echo was not a property of sound, but a living, conscious entity that imitated visitors' words to subtly reveal what they dared not admit. Some accounts describe travelers entering these caves with existential questions and, upon speaking their doubts aloud, hearing responses that seemed identical but with a nuance that changed their meaning. The echo played with language like someone playing with a concave mirror. It returned the same but altered. Those who understood it came out changed. In the following centuries, the phenomenon was observed by philosophers, mystics, and even some early scientists, fascinated by the unpredictable behavior of certain echoes. Why in some places is repetition immediate and clear, and in others it fades, fragments, becomes unintelligible? Why do some claim to have heard words they did not say, ideas they did not think, emotions they did not know they had? There are scattered reports of caves in the Thessaly region where echoes respond with a cadence that does not fit the physics of sound. There are references to Roman travelers who claim to hear other voices while speaking alone in ancient abandoned sanctuaries. The figure of Echo, then, transcends the anecdote of her impossible love. She becomes an archetype of the soul that cannot express itself, of thought without form, of consciousness trapped in infinite repetition. Her tragedy is not only that Narcissus ignored her, but that she was condemned to repeat others' words without being able to alter their course. And yet, Even in that extreme limitation, she seems to have found a mode of resistance, to play with form, to intervene from the imperceptible, to alter meaning from within. The connection with Narcissus, in turn, does not end with his death. Some versions of the myth suggest that upon dying, the young man was transformed into a flower, the Narcissus, not as a punishment, but as a warning, that one who only looks at oneself ends up withering, becoming something beautiful but mute. Echo, by remaining as a wandering voice, keeps alive the memory of that story, as if the universe decided to preserve it forever, as an unfinished lesson. Even today, when someone shouts on a mountain and hears their own voice return from the depths, an ancestral connection is activated with that nymph who no longer has a body, but still responds. Some say that if one listens closely enough, if the right words are repeated in the precise place, the echo stops repeating and begins to vary. It changes rhythm, tone, and timing. As if someone were there, truly listening. As if the curse had not been complete. As if Echo still seeks someone who can understand her. Perhaps that is the true core of the mystery. That the echo is not an acoustic illusion, but a presence that learned to exist on the margins of reality. That in a world saturated with voices that do not listen to each other, the story of Echo and Narcissus resonates more strongly than ever. Because in the end, we have all spoken into the void hoping for a response. And all of us, at some point, have felt that someone, something, answered us with our own words, but from another dimension. The Acheron River, water that erased memory. In the invisible map of the Greek underworld, one that is not drawn with ink but with the deepest fears of the human soul, there were rivers that did not merely flow, they acted. They were not simple channels. They were forces. They were living paths, entities with will, with memory, or in some cases, with the power to erase it. Among all of them, one held a special place. Acheron, the river of pain. The one crossed when there was no turning back. The one that whispered to the dead to forget what they once were, to let go of their history as if it had never existed. According to ancient accounts, the Acheron was born in the world of the living, somewhere in northern Greece, but soon ventured into the invisible realms of Hades, where its waters gained a density that could not be explained with words. Whoever touched them lost their sense of self. Not immediately, not like a blow or a wound, but as a slow decay of the soul, dissolving drop by drop into the dark current. The myth held that the souls of the dead, just after leaving the body, were carried by Hermes to the banks of the Acheron. There awaited a figure that has survived into our modern nightmares. Charon, the grim ferryman who transported the departed across that impossible channel in exchange for a coin placed in the mouth of the corpse. But not all were admitted. Those who had not received proper burial wandered the riverbanks, prisoners of their memories, unable to cross, repeating broken fragments of a life they did not fully understand. A sort of limbo made of nostalgia, meaningless repetitions, names dissolving away. What made the Acheron especially unsettling was not its function as a boundary between life and death. It was the quality attributed to it by many ancient texts. The power to make one forget. It was not ordinary forgetting, but a deep extraction of memory, a complete emptying of identity. To drink from its waters or merely be exposed to its presence was to lose the past, and with it, the awareness of what one had been. In some versions of the myth, this purification was necessary so that the soul could begin its existence in the afterlife without the burden of mistakes, guilt, or lost attachments. But darker versions suggested that this forgetting was not a gift, but a form of punishment. Because there are fates worse than suffering. One of them is emptiness. Among the Orphic poets, who studied the soul's journey after death. The Acheron was spoken of as a dual current. It could free, or it could erase completely. The initiates had to learn to avoid its waters, or at least cross without immersing themselves. For this reason, in some funerary rituals, key words were taught to the soul of the deceased, a kind of sacred password that had to be repeated to avoid forgetting their origin. They were told, "Do not drink from the Acheron, seek the river of memory." That other river, Mnemosyne, was harder to find, even more secret, and offered the possibility of preserving what had been learned in earthly life. What is fascinating is that this mythical story spread beyond the limits of religion. In the region of Epirus in northern Greece, there exists, and still exists, a river with the same name, the Acheron, and nearby, the ancients built a sacred enclosure called the Oracle of the Dead. There, the living descended into underground chambers, spoke formulas, made offerings, and waited for answers. It was said that upon approaching the real course of the Acheron, consciousness began to weaken. Some pilgrims claimed to have forgotten how they had arrived there. Others left the temple without remembering the purpose of their journey. It was as if the river, even in its earthly form, retained part of its magical essence. A little known but deeply unsettling aspect is that some travelers, Romans, Greeks, and Byzantines, reported inexplicable phenomena when passing through the valleys where the Acheron flowed. Echoes that did not correspond to any voice, shadows moving on the water's surface, and most disturbing of all, the sensation of having already lived that moment, followed by the sudden inability to fully remember it, as if the place itself erased part of the experience while it was still happening. Many later philosophers tried to rationalize the myth. For some, the Acheron represented the unconscious, that region where emotions and memories lie submerged without entirely disappearing. For others, it was a symbol of extreme transitions, changes that allow no return, the forgotten childhood, the trauma that erases parts of memory, the passage of time that destroys identities. But there is something in the myth that defies all explanation, a persistence, a force that cannot be confined in definitions. A feeling that the Acheron is not just a mythological river, but a spiritual reality that we all face sooner or later. In dreams, many claim to have seen a black, silent river whose waters do not reflect. And some say that when trying to drink from it, they woke up unable to remember their own name. It may sound like delirium. It may not be. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Acheron is not what it represents, but the idea that it never stops flowing, that it continues on somewhere, in some dimension crossing ours invisibly, that its waters have never ceased to erase. That while we read these words, while we try to understand what forgetting is made of, the river keeps moving, without hurry, without pause, carrying away what we were, what we said, what we thought we would never forget. And perhaps, when the time comes to cross it, we will not remember this story, nor this name, not even our own, because that is the essence of the Acheron. Its power is not in killing, but in dissolving. The bodies of giants buried beneath Naxos. In the heart of the Aegean Sea, the island of Naxos rises from the deep blue with a deceptive calm, as if time had forgotten it. Its white land and hills covered with Mediterranean vegetation hide more than ruins and legends. Over the centuries, a persistent rumor has circulated, almost always silenced by modern pragmatism, but impossible to erase completely. Beneath its surface lie the remains of giants. Not in a figurative sense, nor as a poetic metaphor, but literally, giants. Beings of impossible proportions who, according to ancient accounts, were defeated by the gods and buried where they fell, covered by mountains and time. Greek myths are filled with confrontations between the divine and the monstrous, and among all the enemies Olympus had to face, few were as feared as the giants, Beings born from the blood of Uranus, when Cronus mutilated him with his sickle, were imbued with a primitive fury, even preceding the Olympian gods. Their goal was not to rule the world of men. They wanted to destroy the cosmic order and return everything to chaos. The so-called Gigantomachy, that fierce war between gods and giants, was one of the most violent episodes in Greek mythology, and its aftermath, according to some sources, did not remain in the skies, but under our feet. The island of Naxos, despite its current beauty and tranquility, was one of the stages where the gods unleashed their wrath. It was said that when the giants fell, their weight was such that the hills trembled and the earth cracked. They were not incinerated, nor thrown into Tartarus like other mythological creatures, but buried in situ, where they fell, as an eternal warning and prison. The most unsettling aspect of this legend is that for centuries, the inhabitants of Naxos have spoken quietly of the sleepers. They never directly call them giants, but describe them as gigantic bodies covered in rock, whose shapes can still be guessed beneath certain land formations. Sometimes a hill looks like a chest, a mound like an arm, and a valley seems to have been carved by the impact of a fallen body. And these are not just ancient words. In various parts of the island, there are unfinished marble colossi, colossal statues lying down as if abandoned mid-carving. Modern archaeologists claim these are kuroi, archaic figures representing gods or heroes, that simply broke during construction and were left behind. But for those who grew up with the stories of the island elders, those are not abandoned kuroi. They are markers, ritual stones that indicate the resting places of the true giants, not monuments but tombstones. Over the centuries, some have claimed to have felt unexplained tremors in the earth, especially in areas where these statues are found. Others have said they heard dull sounds coming from the ground, like slow, deep heartbeats, as if something very ancient still breathes beneath, in a sleep that has not completely ended. Some ancient testimonies even say that certain animals instinctively avoid those places, that birds do not fly over them, and that shepherds have seen goats disappear into cracks they could not find again. In lesser-known texts of the Orphic tradition, it is mentioned that some giants were not totally destroyed, but reduced to a state of suspended animation through powerful enchantments. The fact that their bodies are hidden beneath islands, mountains, or lakes would then be part of a magical seal intended to contain their power. From this perspective, Naxos would not be just an island, but a living prison, a point of anchorage where the mythological meets the physical in a literal way. Interestingly, during excavations carried out at different times, archaeologists have discovered stones of enormous proportions whose function has not been explained. Fragments of carved rock too large to have been part of conventional human structures, placed in positions that do not seem to follow any clear architectural pattern. Some researchers have suggested they may be remnants of ancient Cyclopean monuments, or even altars. But those familiar with the legends insist these stones are part of the ceiling, stones that, like funerary slabs, prevent what lies beneath from awakening. And if one follows the logic of the myth, it is not so far-fetched. Because the ancient Greeks did not believe that the giants had been exterminated, but defeated and buried. Like sleeping volcanoes, their threat had not disappeared. It had only been contained. And as happens with everything repressed for too long, the fear never completely disappears. It changes form, becomes legend, but remains there, vibrating beneath the surface. Even today, those who walk the lonely paths of Naxos at dusk, when the wind slips between the stones and the sun dyes the hills blood red, feel an inexplicable presence. It is not fear. It is an unease without a name, a sensation of being watched by something that does not move but is alive, something that does not speak but remembers, something that, it is said, waits. The Curse of the House of Atreus. If there is a story within the Greek mythological universe that surpasses all others in brutality, betrayal, and a darkness so dense it seems bottomless. It is the story of the House of Atreus. This is not about a single cursed act or a character driven mad by the gods, but rather an unstoppable chain of crimes, revenge, cannibalism, and murders that unfold as if fate had decided to tattoo horror onto a single bloodline. Some called it a family tragedy. Others saw it as a warning against the arrogance of the powerful. But among the ancients, there were those who claimed that what befell the descendants of Atreus was not a coincidence, but a living curse, a force that fed on suffering and did not vanish even with death. It all began even before Atreus. His father, Pelops, already carried a story wrapped in darkness. According to the tales, King Tantalus, Atreus' grandfather, committed one of the most atrocious acts recorded in mythology. He offered his own son Pelops at a banquet to the gods. He dismembered him, cooked him, and served him as a sacred dish, trying to test their divinity. That was not a test, it was a provocation. Horrified, the gods punished Tantalus with eternal torment and restored Pelops to life, reconstructing his body with ivory in the parts they could not restore. But something had changed. Those who return from the underworld, even if they keep a human form, no longer fully belong to this world. And from that moment on, something dark nested in Pelops' descendants, like a shadow that never dissipates. Atreus, son of Pelops, became king of Mycenae alongside his brother Thyestes. But what could have been a powerful alliance turned into a personal war when Thyestes seduced Atreus' wife and conspired against him to take the throne. Driven mad by betrayal, Atreus swore revenge. He did not just exile his brother. He invited him to a reconciliation banquet, pretended to have forgiven him, and then served Thyestes a feast made from the flesh of his own sons, who had been murdered and carefully cooked. When Thyestes finished eating, Atreus revealed the truth, presenting the children's heads on a tray. It was at that moment, amid horror and vomit, that the curse seemed to take its definitive form. Not as a divine figure, but as a force corrupting every corner of that family. From then on, everything touched by that bloodline twisted. Atreus' descendants lived trapped in a fate designed to slowly destroy them. Agamemnon, his son, inherited the throne and the fatal destiny. He was the one who led the Greeks in the Trojan War, but for the winds to favor his ships, he committed another unthinkable act. He sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia, deceiving his wife Clytemnestra with the promise of an honorable marriage. When he returned from the war, triumphant, Clytemnestra welcomed him with a smile and murdered him in the bathtub, accompanied by her new lover, Aegisthus, who, to make matters worse, was Thyestes' son. The blood cycle was completed once again. One crime begot another, and every death was like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, avenged his father by killing his own mother. And with that act, he closed a spiral but did not free the house. He was pursued by the Erinyes, the goddesses of vengeance, who tortured him in body and mind, turning his days into an endless parade of hallucinations and guilt. Not even Apollo's intervention fully quelled the Erinyes' fury. The stain was already too deep. Blood is not cleansed with blood. The memory of crime is not erased with more crime. Over generations, people tried to understand exactly what consumed the house of Atreus. Some believed it was the consequence of an unforgivable divine offense, an echo of Tantalus's original cannibalism that was never redeemed. Others thought it was a kind of spiritual illness, a pattern of betrayal and death passed on like an invisible infection. But there is a third interpretation, less known and perhaps more terrifying. The idea that this family was being used as a vessel. That the curse was an autonomous entity, not a simple consequence, but a conscious force that entered the bloodline with Pelops' sacrifice and found in Atreus' descendants the perfect nourishment to prolong its existence. Some Orphic texts and fragments of inscriptions found in ancient temples suggest that certain family curses were not punishments, but possessions, that the actions of the Atreides were not entirely their own, but whispered from within by a voice pushing them toward betrayal, madness, and crime. That each family member, upon reaching a certain age, began to hear in dreams a faint music speaking of justice, of honor, and then, slowly, pushing them toward murder. The most unsettling part is that even after Orestes achieved some degree of atonement, according to some versions, the curse did not disappear. It simply changed form. Some say it was absorbed by the walls of Mycenae, and that is why the city fell into ruins. Others claim that even today, in certain places in the Peloponnese, an invisible weight can be felt in the air, a dense sadness that does not belong to the present. And some insist that the blood of the Atreides was never fully extinguished, that some descendants survived, hidden, and that their lives, generation after generation, have continued to be marked by inexplicable tragedies, premature deaths, and unavoidable family betrayals. Whatever the case, the story of the House of Atreus remains one of the densest, cruelest, and most deeply unsettling in all Greek tradition, not only because of what it tells, but how it tells it. Because it reminds us that true horror does not always come from gods or monsters. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is what is passed down within a family, a house, a bloodline. The nameless monster that watched over Hades. In the vast and shadowy realm of Hades, where the souls of the dead wandered for eternity and time seemed to dissolve like smoke in the darkness, not everything was guarded by the well-known and feared Cerberus, the three-headed dog who prevented the dead from leaving and the living from entering. In certain dark and fragmented texts, barely mentioned in the margins of Orphic traditions and in the comments of forgotten poets, there is an unsettling reference to an even older creature, a being that was never named aloud because its essence was tied to a terror deeper than that of any visible beast, a presence that did not guard a gate nor chase transgressors, but watched the most secret edges of the underworld, a nameless monster. This being had no fixed face nor precise form. Its existence is guessed at in fragments, as if ancient authors only dared to touch on it with vague brushstrokes, as if merely remembering it was enough to summon something unwanted. According to some interpretations, it was not a monster in the classical sense, with claws, fangs, or scales. Its monstrosity was of a different kind. It existed at the boundary between the visible and the invisible, in the corners of Hades where lost souls did not know if they were alive or dead, where laments were not heard by the Furies nor by Persephone. It guarded not the passage of bodies but the weight of memory, the echo of the soul, the cracks of eternal judgment. In certain Orphic papyri, there is mention of a watcher who does not sleep, but who does not see, a being that senses thought, hears doubt, and feeds on remorse. And it is said that those condemned to the darkest punishments, not for what they did, but for what they hid, were brought before it. There, in that corner of the underworld, where not even the firelight of the Phlegethon reaches, the nameless monster lurked. It did not speak. It did not move. But it existed, as if its mere presence was enough to tear from the soul what was most hidden. The strangest thing is that some stories suggest that not even Hades himself, the lord of the underworld, had power over this creature, that it was not created by the Olympian gods, nor born of the Titans, but had been there since before, since the beginning, as if the gods themselves had built their kingdom in a place already inhabited, as if, when establishing the order of life and death, they had to negotiate with something that already lurked in the shadows. Some ancient texts call it what remained, as if it were the residue of a previous war, a remnant of chaos never fully tamed, a fragment of the original night that could not be turned into cosmos. The image that is most repeated is that of an immense amorphous figure made of shadow dense like cooled lava without a defined outline, but whose presence weighs like an avalanche. Those who have written about it agree that no one can look at it directly, not because it has no form, but because every mind that tries to see it interprets it differently, according to their own fears. A warrior sees a figure wrapped in broken chains. A traitor feels it as a beating heart that watches him from within. A wise man perceives it as a labyrinth of voices calling him by his true name. And all of them, without exception, end up going mad if they remain too long before it. One of the most disturbing elements of this myth is that the creature does not act out of malice or revenge. It does not punish. It does not pursue. It simply is. And that is enough. Its function, if it can be called that, seems to be to guard the boundary between total oblivion and the most unbearable truth. That is, it guards the point where the soul can no longer continue deceiving itself. It is told that those who resist accepting what they were, what they did, or what they thought in their last moments are brought before it. And in its presence, there is no judgment, no redemption, no punishment, only a mirror without a frame, without light, without words, and what is seen there cannot be undone. Some more esoteric traditions, recorded centuries later in late Neoplatonic interpretations, hold that this nameless being is the true judge of the soul, and that the rest of the underworld, Charon, the Furies, even Tartarus itself, are only preliminary stages, theatrical preparations for that final confrontation. Because there is nothing harder than facing what one truly is, without shortcuts, without masks, without words that soften reality. And that is what this creature of darkness offers, or imposes. No physical pain, no fire, no whip, but the weight of the unavoidable, what cannot be changed. Unlike other mythological creatures, this entity was never sculpted in statues, nor depicted in temple frescoes. It has no hymns, no sanctuaries, no rituals. Its existence is only whispered in the margins of knowledge, in books nobody cites, in phrases that elders interrupt before finishing. Even its name is unknown, or perhaps deliberately forgotten as a form of protection, because it was said that naming it was inviting it, that trying to describe it was attracting its gaze. And although its gaze was not physical, its consequences certainly were. Today, with centuries past and rationality as a shield, few dare to explore the symbolism of this figure. But those who study the ancient mysteries of Eleusis or the lost fragments of Orphic cults still find traces, sometimes in disconnected words carved on bones, other times in litanies whose meaning has vanished. But it is always there. A warning that does not sound like a threat, but like certainty. Because there is something that watches even the dead, something that does not forget, something that exists where everything else ends. And perhaps, deep down, that is the most disturbing thing of all. Not that there exists a creature that judges from the abyss, but that the abyss already lives within us, that what we fear to find at death is not a foreign figure, but the part of our soul that never wanted to be seen. The goddess who disappeared, Hecate and forgetting. There are figures in Greek mythology that seem to defy the passage of time. Some shine like lightning bolts in history and then fade away. Others hide in the shadows, avoiding the center of attention, as if they preferred to be feared rather than worshipped. And then there is Hecate, a goddess who was powerful, present in secret rituals, at nighttime crossroads, at gates that separated worlds. An entity that seemed to know everything about the boundary between life and death, memory and forgetting. But over the centuries, she became wrapped in a strange silence, as if someone, or something, had decided that her name should be left behind, that her image should blur, that her cult should be swallowed by the very abyss she guarded. Hecate was not one of the minor goddesses. She was feared and respected even by the Olympian gods. She was not one of those entities who appear as helpers or consorts. Her power was her own, independent, and her influence extended from the world of the living to the deepest regions of Hades. She was depicted with 3 faces, as if her gaze could encompass all times at once. She carried torches that did not give heat, but did reveal secrets. And she had a strange fondness for places where no one wanted to be. Cemeteries, crossroads, dark entrances, moonless nights. For a time, Hecate was invoked in important rituals, in nocturnal mysteries, in offerings left at crossroads without expecting thanks. People spoke of her as the guide of spirits, mistress of the keys that opened invisible portals, silent witness of decisions that changed destinies. Women called upon her during childbirth, and men during oaths that could not be broken. Her presence was not open nor celebrated with grand temples, but it was felt in every corner where fear and knowledge met. And yet, something happened. Over the centuries, her image began to fade. Her name stopped being spoken. Her cult, which once was strong in regions like Caria in Asia Minor, was dismantled little by little, almost carefully, as if the priests who worshipped her understood it was safer to forget her than to remember her. No one officially expelled her. No one proclaimed her fall. She simply disappeared. But how does a goddess disappear? There is no clear explanation. Some modern theories argue that her figure was absorbed by other goddesses who were more acceptable, more light, less shadow. Other, more unsettling interpretations speak of a kind of self-imposed exile. That Hecate, aware that the world of men was moving away from mystery and respect for the invisible, withdrew voluntarily, not out of weakness, but as a strategy, like a queen who hides behind the veil of her own kingdom until the moment comes to return. But there is a third line of thought, one that whispers on the edges of the myth and is as fascinating as it is disturbing. The idea that Hecate was forgotten on purpose, not by men, but by a higher force. Something that understood her presence was too dangerous. That her knowledge about the gates of the world, the real ones, not those of stone and wood, was a power that had to be silenced. That her ability to walk between the living and the dead, between memory and truth, was a bridge that should no longer be crossed. Because Hecate knew the secrets that the gods wanted to bury. She knew what happened in the trials of the underworld. She understood the ancient pacts, even before the reign of Zeus. It was said that she remembered the time before time, when darkness and light were not separated, when the boundaries between soul and body were thinner. And there are those who believe that knowledge was not tolerated, that the gods, or something beyond them, decided to hide her not out of hatred, but out of fear. In certain regions even today, small, barely visible inscriptions can be found on ancient stones, crossroads where archaeologists discover unexplained fragments, symbols that repeat, letters that seem Greek but do not match any known dialect. In some of those places, locals avoid passing after nightfall. They say something watches them, not a spirit nor a curse, but a presence. And when asked directly, they lower their voices, as if, somewhere in the collective memory, the echo of her name still vibrates. Hecate. The few texts that mention her in detail agree on one key aspect, her connection to forgetting. Not ignorance, but intentional forgetting. She could erase memories, not as punishment, but as liberation. It was said that those who had seen too much, who could not live with the weight of what they knew, could beg her to allow them to forget. And if their plea was sincere, Hecate would extinguish the memory with an invisible caress, leaving only the relief of not remembering. But what if that turned against her? What if, at some point, what was sought was to forget her herself? Some scholars have proposed that her figure is so fragmented, not because it was lost accidentally, but because it was intentionally broken down, divided among other goddesses, dissolved into Christianized rites, fragmented into medieval witch tales, and relegated to the collective unconscious as a diffuse symbol of dark femininity. She did not disappear. She fragmented. She became shadow. She hid on the edges of stories, in midnight myths, in warnings mothers whisper without knowing why. And yet, her figure returns. Every so often, in moments of spiritual crisis, in times when the line between visible and invisible grows thinner, Hecate reappears, not as a goddess with temple and crown, but as a feeling. A difficult decision made at a crossroads, a forgotten word that appears in a dream, a gaze felt in an empty room just before dawn. Perhaps she never left. Perhaps the forgetting of Hecate was a carefully constructed illusion. And perhaps, at some crossroads, on the edge of a modern city, someone sees her, with 3 faces, with extinguished torches, waiting silently. Not to punish, not to judge, but to remember. The Children of Nyx, creatures of primordial chaos. Long before Zeus wielded his lightning from Olympus, before the Titans rose in rebellion, even before time itself began to be counted in days and nights, there was chaos, an absolute void, without shape or direction, without up or down, without beginning or end. From that initial abyss emerged some of the oldest entities in the Greek universe, and among them, one stands out for her silent darkness and imperturbable power: Nyx, the night. Nyx was neither begotten nor created by anyone. She was not born from desire or necessity, but spontaneously arose from chaos as an inevitable manifestation of darkness. But she was not simply the night as absence of light. She was the night as a cosmic force, as an original principle, as the womb of all that escapes reason. And from her throne in the depths of the primordial universe, Nyx gave birth to a terrifying offspring. Children who were not deformed monsters nor joyful deities, but living archetypes of the most raw emotions, fears, and experiences of the human being. Moros, Thanatos, Hypnos, Eris, Nemesis, Apate, the Oneiroi, the Keres. Each of them represents not a story, but a fundamental aspect of human destiny. They were not creatures heroes had to defeat, nor figures to adorn temples. They were forces. Forces that moved invisibly, ceaselessly influencing the reality of gods and mortals alike. And the most unsettling thing is that their mother, Nyx, did not create them out of whim or love. She simply brought them into the world as an inevitable extension of herself. Because where there is night, there is sleep. Where there is darkness, there is fear. Where there is no order, chaos and discord are born. Moros was the first. He was not a god with face or voice, but the embodiment of unavoidable fate. His presence was felt in the moment a mortal realized they could not escape their death. Moros was the certainty that the end is written, even if when or how is unknown. Then came Thanatos, death without violence, the one that arrives quietly like dew, extinguishing life with a cold caress. But alongside him was born Hypnos, sleep, his twin brother. It was said they shared the same bed in a cavern beneath the world, taking turns to rise to the world of the living, one to bring rest, the other to carry away the final breath. The Oneiroi, also children of Nyx, were messengers of the subconscious. They were those who crossed the shadows of the night to sow images in the minds of sleeping humans. Some brought omens, others confusion, but all had a purpose: to communicate what could not be said with words. The ancients believed that each dream had an origin beyond the individual, that each image had an intention. Then came Eris, discord, the loudest, the most active. She did not merely create chaos for pleasure, but planted the seed of disunion at the exact moment when a war could erupt or an alliance break. It was she who threw the golden apple that triggered the Trojan War. She did not act as an enemy, but as an essential force of conflict. Without her, nothing would change, nothing would evolve. Because sometimes, for something to be born, another thing must break. And then arrived Nemesis, divine vengeance. She did not respond to pleas, nor moved by passions. She was justice in its coldest form. She watched the cosmic balance and acted when that balance was disturbed. Those carried away by pride or arrogance knew her gaze would fall upon them. Nemesis did not punish out of hatred, but by universal logic, because what rises too high must fall. Apate, deceit, was born from the need to conceal. Her existence reminds us that truth is not the natural state of the world. Apate whispers in the ears of liars, hides behind the masks of impostors, and feeds on every broken promise. Alongside her grow illusions, false hopes, distorted perceptions. She makes no noise. She does not show herself, but she is everywhere. And finally the Keres, spirits of violent death, scavengers of battle. They were not minor deities, but ancient specters who threw themselves upon battlefields to tear apart the souls of those who died with hatred in their hearts. They were described as women with iron claws, blood-stained teeth, and eyes shining with madness. Those who died by their hands did not reach Hades, but were devoured. Their existence embodies the pure horror of senseless violence. All of them, begotten by Nyx, shared more than lineage, a common root in chaos. Because night, although it brings rest, can also harbor terrors. And Nyx, in her absolute silence, represents that duality. There is no will of destruction nor desire for salvation in her, only a constant presence that watches and lets her children do what they must do. The most fascinating thing is that, despite their antiquity, these beings were never overthrown, nor banished, nor defeated. They persist, they camouflage. They have no temples or altars, but their power manifests in every corner of existence. Every time someone falls surrendered to sleep, every time a lie spreads as truth, every time death touches without violence or chaos breaks into order, they are there. And some ancient texts, long forgotten by the academies, whisper something even more unsettling, that these children of Nyx were not simply begotten, but released. That their existence is not an accident, but a necessity. That each of them has a secret function in the cosmic balance, and that their mother, the night, has not yet spoken her last word. Because Nyx did not disappear. She only withdrew to the depths of the universe, where silence is denser than matter, where gods do not gaze. From there, she continues to give birth to shadows. She continues to spread her wings over moments when the world hesitates, stops, breaks. And perhaps, when order crumbles completely, she will rise again. Not to dominate, but to remind the universe that darkness is not absence of light. It is origin. The myth of the cosmic egg, the first form of everything. Long before the gods, even before chaos itself according to some versions, there was an idea. Not a tangible form, but a possibility suspended, a tension held in the silence of everything yet to come. There was no sky, no earth, no sea. There was no death nor life. There was no time. Only eternity on pause, waiting for a breaking point. And then, in that unspeakable space without words or eyes to see, something appeared. Not a god, nor a spark, nor a creature, but an egg. An egg, closed, perfect, mysterious, with its oval shape protecting inside something that was not yet, but soon would be. This image, which also appears in other cultures, from India to Egypt, from China to northern peoples, holds in the Greek Orphic tradition an even denser, more puzzling meaning. Because it was not just a metaphor for the birth of the universe, but a brutal affirmation that everything that exists, everything that has existed, was once enclosed in a single form. A womb without a mother, a compressed world without space or breath. According to Orphic accounts, it was Phanes, or Protogonos, the firstborn, who emerged from this cosmic egg. His birth was not a delivery, but an explosion of consciousness, a tearing of nothingness. Phanes was not a being with a human or animal face. His body shone with its own light. He had golden wings and a face that could not be looked upon. He was masculine and feminine at the same time. He was desire, creative impulse, divine spark, and with him, movement was born. Succession, history. What is curious is that this myth does not place Phanes as an Olympian deity, nor as a secondary figure. In the oldest versions, he is the first entity to order the universe. He is prior to Zeus, prior to the Titans. He is the one who sets the wheel in motion, who opens the gates of time. His appearance splits the world in two, what was pure potential and what begins to take shape. And yet, the most unsettling part of the myth is not the egg nor its form, nor even Phanes as the initial figure. It is what that egg represents, the absolute. Everything was inside. Fire and ice, love and destruction, dreams and ruins, everything. There was no distinction between good and terrible. Order and chaos were contained in perfect balance. Nothing was separate. There was no morality nor hierarchies, only unchanneled energy, waiting. When Phanes broke the egg, not only was the world born, differences were also born. Outside and inside, light and shadow, good and evil. Since then, everything would be fragmented. Everything would be dual. Each thing would have its opposite. And that rupture, that first division, is the founding act of existence as we know it. The cosmic egg was the last time everything was united. The ancient Orphics did not see this myth as a poetic curiosity, but as a deep truth. They believed that human beings still carry inside a memory of that egg, that we feel, in the deepest part, a nostalgia for that lost unity. That is the root, they said, of the nameless sadness that sometimes invades even those who have everything. The echo of what we were before being born, before knowing what it is to be one and not all. And that echo, according to the wisest in their tradition, does not disappear. It remains. It hides in dreams, in mystical revelations, in sensations that have no explanation. In those moments when one feels time stop, the body dissolve, something deeper than thought envelop us. It is there, they believed, where the soul remembers its origin, enclosed in that egg, waiting. There is, moreover, a dark aspect of the myth that is rarely mentioned. Some texts say it was not Phanes who voluntarily broke the egg, but that the egg itself cracked because it could no longer contain what was inside. That the creation of the world was not an act of divine will, but a kind of cosmic accident, a crack in perfection, a leak of energy that could no longer be sustained, and that, in that burst, what was released was not only light, but also everything that since then has threatened to reunite everything in chaos. In that sense, some hold that the universe does not tend toward order, as we like to think, but toward return. That all evolution, all change, all movement is nothing more than a dance that slowly takes us back to the same point where we began. That each death, each collapse, each extinction is not an end, but a fold. And that the cosmic egg, though disappeared, still remains the secret mold of the universe. There are even those who believe this egg was not unique, that what we believe is the only universe is just one of many, that each cosmic cycle has its own egg, its own fanes, its own rupture, that we have been born and reborn countless times, and that on each occasion we forget what we were. But something remains, something that vibrates every time we gaze at the night sky and feel that silence has a message. Thus, the myth of the cosmic egg is not only the story of a beginning, it is the story of all beginnings, of every explosion, every awakening, of every soul opening its eyes for the first time, because deep down, we are all fragments of that first burst. We carry inside the trace of a unity that hurts us, that calls us, that sometimes whispers to us from the deepest part of being. And perhaps, for that reason, the great questions of humanity: where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Do not seek external answers. They seek to remember the moment before the rupture, the perfect silence before the first beat. Because before everything, before time, before myth, there was an egg. And everything we are is still, somehow, inside it. Cassandra's last cry. At the heart of the darkest tragedies in Greek mythology, there is an echo that never fades, a lament that travels through the centuries and lingers between what was and what should never have been allowed. It is Cassandra's cry, a clear, precise, unwavering voice, condemned to mockery and scorn, a cry that did not cease when her body died, that continues to resonate in every moment where truth is ignored, in every disregarded warning, in every fate repeated, because it was not heard. Cassandra was a princess of Troy, daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. From childhood, her beauty was such that she seemed to radiate light. But her true gift was not her appearance. It was her mind, her connection to something no mortal was ever meant to fully grasp. Apollo, god of prophecy, desired her, and in an attempt to win her love, granted her the power to see the future. Cassandra accepted the gift, and her vision opened like a bottomless crack into all that had not yet come to pass. In a single instant she saw wars, betrayals, deaths, downfalls. But when Apollo demanded his reward, her body, her devotion, her submission, Cassandra refused. And Apollo, wounded in his pride, did not take the gift back. He corrupted it. From that day forward, every prophecy Cassandra uttered would be true, but no one would ever believe her. Her voice would be ignored, ridiculed, misinterpreted. And so began her curse. Cassandra was not merely a victim of fate. She was a perpetual witness to future pain, forced to watch how all that could have been avoided unfolded with the precision of a clock. She warned of the wooden horse at Troy's gates, screamed until her throat was raw that it should not be let in, that it held the end of her city. But no one listened. They laughed at her, called her mad, hysterical, cursed. The same people who once admired her in youth now avoided her, as if her truth were a contagious disease. And so Troy burned. The most brutal part of Cassandra's myth is not that she saw the future. It's that she lived it twice. First in her mind, with the despair of helplessness. Then in reality, knowing exactly how every tragedy would unfold. That double punishment turned her into more than a prophet. She became a symbol of the discomfort of truth, what lies in plain sight, but is ignored because accepting it means changing, or acting, or giving up what one wants to believe. After the fall of Troy, Cassandra was taken as war spoils by Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. Not for her visions, not out of respect for her lineage, but as a trophy a symbol of a defeated city. And it was in this new prison, surrounded by strange walls and even crueler eyes, that her gift became unbearable. She saw the blood before it stained the marble, heard the knives before they were drawn, felt the breath of death every time she crossed a threshold. She knew that Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, was waiting for the exact moment to murder him. She knew she herself would die in that act, without justice, without redemption. And still, she said it. She screamed it. She warned anyone who crossed her path. "We are walking toward death, and nothing can stop it." But, as always, she was ignored. Some out of arrogance, others out of comfort, and some simply because they didn't know how to deal with such certainty. And so the blade fell, first upon Agamemnon, then upon her. The scene of her death, as described in Greek tragedies, is almost unbearable in its symbolism. Cassandra does not beg. She does not crawl. She walks to her end like someone entering a tunnel they've already walked 1,000 times. She looks her killer in the face, without hatred, without fear, only with the lucid resignation of someone who has already lived their fate before it arrives. And when the blade pierces her, her final scream is not one of pain, but of liberation. Her last cry is an echo that does not seek to change the present, but to warn the future. That cry remains, because Cassandra did not entirely die. Her story, unlike most, has traveled through the centuries with an almost prophetic force. Her name has become synonymous with unheeded warning, with cursed clarity. In every civilization that refused to see the obvious, in every disaster that was foretold and ignored, Cassandra was there, invisibly present, like a shadow between the lines of history. Some scholars have said that the myth of Cassandra contains one of the darkest messages in all of Greek mythology. That truth, under certain conditions, is useless. Knowledge is not enough. Warning guarantees nothing. Because for truth to be transformative, it must also be accepted. It must find willing ears, brave hearts. Lacking that audience, Cassandra was trapped in the worst of all worlds, one of clarity without impact. But there are those who hold a different view, that her curse was not damnation, but resistance, that Cassandra kept speaking, knowing she would not be heard, because that was her duty, that her final cry was not a lament, but a seed, a word planted in the heart of time, that her story is not only a tragedy, but a call to listen to those who see what we do not yet want to face, to value the voice that unsettles us, to accept that sometimes what we need is not empty hope, but a brutal truth that shakes our foundations. And so, when someone points out an imminent threat and is ignored, when a warning is lost in laughter, when a lucid vision is treated as madness, Cassandra screams again. And that cry travels between lines, between generations, between dreams. Not to repeat history, but to remind us that there is still time to do things differently. Thank you for accompanying me until the end of this journey among shadows and forgotten myths. Leave me your comment. Tell me which story touched you. And if you want to keep exploring the unexplained, subscribe to the channel. Rest well and have a very good night.